Welcome, everybody. I'd love to introduce Keith Wiebe for, actually, I don't, Wiebe?
Wiebe. Yep.
Wiebe, okay, good. Keith Wiebe from IFPRI, which, there it is. That's actually decoding. On the website, you didn't have International Food Policy Research Institute. Yeah, and yeah, he's been doing a lot of fantastic work on the global food system and understanding kind of the flows of food and what we can do to, well, make sure that everybody has enough. Welcome, Keith.
Good. Thanks very much, Greg, and thank you all for joining. I'm happy to have this opportunity to talk about our work. I'm going to be drawing on a book we published a few months ago called What Do We Know About the Future of Food Systems? And today I'm going to draw on some of those results as well as from some of our other recent work, particularly using IFPRI's impact modeling system, which I'll introduce in just a few minutes. Wanted to first of all just acknowledge that this work draws on lots of contributions. I have a core team at IFPRI, International Food Policy Research Institute, as well as collaborators around the world. So wanted to make sure that they all are acknowledged for the work that they've contributed. So let's jump right in then. Start briefly to just ask the question, what are food systems? I mean, we're all accustomed to thinking about food production, food consumption, but it's important to think about the system as a whole, the things that link production to consumption through transportation, storage, processing, and so forth. What's upstream of the production process, the land, water resources, labor, and technology. And then behind all of these, the policy environment, investments, innovation, infrastructure, and so forth that connect these things. So they add up to a big, complicated system, lots of interlinked pieces, lots of uncertainty, and it takes time for things that happen in one of these domains to ripple through into the others, and therefore it's important to think ahead about the food system we'd like to see in the future. And some of the challenges we face, Greg, you already alluded to one of them. Will we produce enough? Populations continue to rise. This has been a question ever since Thomas Malthus. Some of you may remember he wrote a book on population about a little over 200 years ago now, where he was concerned that productivity was going to continue increasing at sort of a linear rate, whereas population was going to grow much faster, and we were all doomed to a future of famine and starvation and so forth. So he's the one that earned economics the label the dismal science, and not without good reason. But populations continue to rise. That's a challenge in many places, but not everywhere. In some cases, populations are starting to decline, and that brings its own questions. As incomes rise, people eat more, they eat differently. So hunger and micronutrient deficiencies, those persist as problems, but overweight and obesity are also increasing all around the world. Rich countries, poor countries, even within households. So on the production side, land and water resources are under pressure, not only in terms of how much they're expanding, the demands that are put on them, but also quality of those resources, depletion, degradation, and so forth. With all of these things, growth in productivity is slowing over time, and so that raises concerns as well. These are compounded by climate change, which affects crop yields in many diverse ways, as well as infrastructure and other things that are important for the functioning of a food system. And then in the background, of course, things like geopolitical instability complicate all of these existing challenges. So my colleagues and I, we work at the International Food Policy Research Institute, or IFPRI. It's one of a network of international agricultural research centers around the world. IFPRI is about 600 people. We work in 80 countries around the world, as well as at the global scale. And basically with the overall goal of contributing to a world free of hunger and malnutrition. And we do that in three broad ways. The first of which is to understand better where we are in terms of food systems and where those food systems are going. That's the work I'll talk about today. Secondly, identifying, testing, scaling solutions to different parts of those challenges. And thirdly, recognizing that these take place within a context that has institutional and political challenges. And so we try and understand and help to inform those as well. Within IFPRI, my team and I are part of the Foresight and Policy Modeling Unit. And some of the questions that we try to answer are, start with the big ones. Will we be able to produce enough food in the future? This goes way back to Malthus and the challenge that I mentioned a little while ago. If we can produce it, will we be able to afford it? And will it be healthy? Will we be able to do that while still protecting the planet and its resources. So these are big challenges. They're not new, but they really get to the heart of the questions that we address with our work. And more specifically, we do so by asking how will changes in things like population, income, food preferences affect our demand for food? On the flip side, how will changes in technology and climate affect food production? How will both of these things, changes in demand and production, affect affordability and our access to food? And finally, how will changes in food production also affect use of land and water and their implications for ecosystem services? So just to step back for a moment, what can we know about the future of food systems? Well, we don't have a crystal ball, obviously, so we don't know the future with certainty, but there's nevertheless still a lot that we can say by exploring different alternative possible scenarios, what their implications are, what drives those, and importantly, what we can do to shape the course of those pathways in the future, away from things we'd like to avoid and towards goals that we would like to achieve. And as such, foresight's not a new thing. Farmers have done it for 10,000 years. On the cover of our book, we have a picture of 3-year-old Rosita from Indonesia, whose family, every year, every season, they have to plant crops without knowing what the weather is going to be like during the growing season or what the prices are going to be when it's time to sell their harvest a few months down the road. So they use foresight to try and anticipate what are different possible strategies that might work best for them. Large modern corporations use foresight. Armies have used foresight for centuries. Basically, if you've asked the question, what if such and such, you're doing foresight. You're wondering, I'm not sure what's going to happen, but if it goes this way, then I want to be prepared like this. If it's going to go this way, then maybe I have to think differently. And if I can nudge it in one direction or another, so much the better. We do so without certain information, but we do it based on our experience of the past and our expectations about the future. So it's particularly difficult for food systems. It's always difficult thinking about the future, but especially for food systems. Farmers are relatively small decision-making units. Corporations and armies tend to be hierarchical with a CEO or a general or a board of directors or someone. They tend to have fairly clearly defined goals, not always, but generally. With food systems, they're complicated technically, and it's compounded by the fact that every one of us is a food system decision makers. All 8 billion plus of us on the planet, several times a day. Every one of us on this call, we made a decision about a food system or that affects food system already this morning. We'll make more of them later today. And those are all complex interactions with multiple goals, sometimes competing, sometimes synergistic. But that really makes it a complicated thing to investigate. But there are also lots of interesting opportunities to explore there as well. So foresight, we use it in fairly broad definition. It's thinking about the future to inform choices that we make today. And it can take lots of forms, from scanning the horizon to envisioning what we want to achieve, normative versus subjective. We can use simulation modeling, which is what I'll talk about today. But it draws on other things as well. And it's always a good starting point to learn from the past and find as much data as possible. This is the longest data series I'm aware of on a basic food system indicator. These are wheat prices in England going way back to the year 1264. Put together initially by Malthus, was a cleric and an economist. This is another English cleric and economist. I'm not quite sure why they had so many of those. Maybe their doubts in one domain led them to seek refuge in another. But in any case, this was a fellow named Thorold Rogers, who put this together in the mid-1800s. And in it, you can see all the kinds of shocks and influences that we might expect to see. Of course, impacts of weather fluctuations. They're the things that Malthus was concerned about. Changes in population, changes in technology are driving some of these things, but also policy, trade, conflicts. You can see the impacts of world wars and so forth in here as well. But what can we learn from historical data if we're asking, what is this indicator going to look like in the future, say in 2050? Well, if we were foresight modelers back in 1600, looking at this question of what is the price of wheat going to be 500-600 years into the future, we wouldn't be, it wouldn't be unreasonable to think, well, it's going to jump around, but it's probably going to average about what it is today, 400 pounds per ton. Whereas if we ask that question a couple hundred years later, we might say, well, the world has changed, and prices are going up, and it's going to continue because this is the world that we see. And this is the world that Malthus was in, so he was in a context following several centuries of rising prices, rising population, gradually improving technology. And so he came up with his pessimistic projections about the future. That was right before a lot of things changed. Technology innovation started happening more quickly, population started growing more slowly, policies changed, and so forth. Prices started coming down to the point where when this series ended in the 1990s, you might be forgiven for thinking, well, pretty soon they're going to be giving the stuff away. It's just going down to the floor. But where we are today, we're back in the neighborhood of maybe 200 pounds per ton. And the question remains, what might that look like in 2050? So we learn from the past, we learn about these relationships between population and income and demand and technology, but we need to put those together in a different way when we look forward into the future. So statistical approaches are one. Simple models, you might start with a mental conception of how things work. You might dialogue with stakeholders and other people, other experts who have information. Today, we'll be looking at the impact simulation model. Artificial intelligence also has a potential role to play. You're familiar with this quote that we often keep in mind: all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. They're wrong because they're not perfect. That's not their design, but they're useful if they capture the important elements and help us to make useful decisions. I was encouraged to learn that George Box was not talking just about simulation models here. He was a statistician. So even when you have the best data in the world, your statistical model is still going to be wrong by definition, but we hope they're useful. There are a number of models, of economic models of the food system. I'll talk about impact today, but we collaborate with a lot of other partners that have different models around the world, in Japan, in Europe, in North America. A lot of them are tailored to different specific questions, so we learn from each other, we compare notes. Sometimes we work collaboratively on the same question using some of the same assumptions just to see how our findings differ. And generally, the strategy is to do something like this. In our case, climate is a big driver, so we draw information from climate models. We don't do the climate modeling ourselves, but we take outputs from them, particularly as they relate to future changes in temperature, precipitation, solar radiation, things like that. We put those into biophysical models, and in the case of impact, I'll show that in a minute. That includes crop modeling as well as hydrology and other water-related modeling exercises. And those in turn go into an economic modeling framework where we bring in the demand side of things, see how production and demand interact, what that means for prices and trade, and so forth, which then have their own feedback mechanisms into choices of producers and consumers. And ultimately, we're interested on the right here in things like the Sustainable Development Goals, reducing poverty, reducing hunger, clean water, protecting land and resources, and so forth.
So, question: you have already a bunch of community modelers. Do you have something like a modeling to comparison project, like what's called the climate folks have, or the crop yield folks have?
Yep, exactly. So we are part of something called AgMIP, the Agricultural Model Intercomparison and Improvement Project, which brings together climate modelers, crop modelers, economic modelers. Now there are pest and disease modelers. There are a number of different communities. And we draw, for example, in the climate assumptions that we're using here come from CMIP, the CMIP process. And then we ourselves use the DSAT family of crop models, but we can take results from other crop models, and we're connected to the GGCMI Global Gridded Crop Modeling Intercomparison Project as well. So anyway, definitely lots of communities, and that's a big and really positive change over the past. It's been maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years now. Earlier in my career, I'm not a modeler by background, but working with modelers, it seemed like they were they worked much more in isolation, much more sort of protective of their own model. And then through these various MIPs, the environment has definitely changed to a lot more kind of collaborative, sometimes friendly competition, but a lot more information exchange and comparison and so forth. So we've benefited from that. We've also contributed to that with some of the unique strengths that impact has relative to some of the other models. So this is just a schematic of the impact modeling framework. Lots of assumptions and so forth go in on the left-hand side. Those include inputs from crop models, from climate models about temperature and precipitation, so forth. We get projections from demographers from the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, IASA, on population growth projections, from OECD on income growth. And typically we use the standard projections, the input assumptions that these other modeling groups use. We all of us contribute to things like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the assessment reports, and those are organized around standard climate and socioeconomic pathway assumptions. Those feed into crop modeling and water modeling tools that we have, which in turn go into the impact model. It's a partial equilibrium model of the ag sector, but we also iterate with GLOBE, which is a economy-wide general equilibrium model at a global scale, where we feed in projections of productivity change, production change in the ag sector, and they feed us back what that means in terms of changes in income and so forth. And in the end, we get projections on food production and demand in different, by region, by country, by commodity, and prices, trade, what that means ultimately for risk of hunger, micronutrient deficiencies and stuff like that. So relative to the other global economic models, impact is relatively disaggregated, both geographically and by commodities. We have about 160 countries. Those overlap with about 160 water basins, together producing about 300 plus what we call food production units, but those are just spatial definitions, the intersection of countries by water basins. And a relatively disaggregated commodity mix. This was by design because our focus is on developing countries at IFPRI, and so we need to have something that actually looks in detail at what's going on, not just in those regions, but at the country level for the commodities that are of most interest to poor producers and consumers in those countries. So you can see the mix here. There are animal source foods, there are staples, cereals, roots, tubers, fruits, vegetables, oil seeds, and a few specialty crops, so coffee, tea, cocoa, and stuff like that.
So should we be thinking this is a market model or like a macroeconomic, like a full macroeconomic model, or more of like a goods flow kind of model?
No, well, so in the name, which I forget if I actually spelled it out, International Model for Policy Analysis of Agricultural Commodities and Trade. So that it is a market focused and originally production and trade, but demand as well. Over time, it's evolved, just to pay more attention to, things like nutrition, to more attention to resources and environmental impacts and stuff like that, as the questions from our partners have also evolved. But it's not macro. The macro comes from this GLOBE model that we do interact with. That's an economy-wide.
Mm-hmm.
But even there, it's not a macroeconomic model in the sense of understanding things like well, all of the macroeconomic detail that you would get, say, in a model of the U.S. economy with financial sector and inflation and all those kinds of things. We take a lot of those things as inputs, and the same is true of basic productivity trajectories. We have a initial baseline. We develop that in collaboration with our partners around the world, experts in different commodities, both in the breeding side as well as the market side. But those are things that go into the model, and then we look at the interaction, how that relates to changes on the demand side, preferences, and so forth, and how the prices then feedback to both influence what consumers choose, but also what producers choose.
Got it. Thank you.
So I think maybe I don't need to spend much time on SSPs and RCPs. You're familiar with that. We do model different SSP pathways, but we tend to focus on SSP2, the middle of the road one, as our reference case, and then around that we may look at changes in policies or investments as alternative scenarios. In SSP2, so population is one of our big drivers of demand. highest and here we see SA, SEA, South Asia, Southeast and East Asia, that are where populations are highest, but they're slowing down, even starting to turn down in the projection period for Southeast and East Asia. That's principally China. Whereas down at the bottom, you see lower levels to start, but rapid growth in West and Central Africa, WCA, and Eastern Southern Africa, ESA. And so that's population is going to be a big driver of demand change in those regions. Likewise, on the income side over on the right, starts out at lower levels in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, but rising in all regions. And that combination of population growth and income growth generates increases in food demand, but it takes different forms in different regions, depending on where they're starting from. Productivity growth is a really important driver as well. This is a graph from Keith Fugly, used to be at USDA and retired recently. At the bottom, you see land, of course, is a essential contributor, but I want to focus on the yellow and the green parts of this figure. Going back to the 1960s, yellow represents inputs, more fertilizer and more chemicals. That was the biggest driver of increases in production back then in the Green Revolution, early Green Revolution days. But over time, the relative and absolute contribution of those has declined relative to total factor productivity, which is essentially the things that aren't measured by tangible inputs. And it comes out in the form of improved crop varieties, better management practices, more precise application of inputs in type, in quantity, in the timing of them as well. And that really makes a huge difference. So this is a global picture. It happens in most regions, although some regions lag, and we'll see a little bit later that particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, they're about 20 years behind the frontier on this one. So for them, increases in area and inputs are still a major source of growth and productivity. So just briefly, climate change obviously is a key driver as well. This graph, it's busy. The stuff on the top has to do with a lot of global processes, ice sheets, glaciers, rainforests that are affected at different levels of warming. If you can disregard those, I really want to focus just on the temperature line, which starts at the lower left, moves across and up and to the right. These are going back 20,000 years, degrees Celsius relative to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And here we are today, just at this turning point recently where things are starting to go up with higher emissions, global warming, and so forth, and projected to continue on depending on which representative concentration pathway we follow, but rising into the future. What strikes me and what I wanted to show here in particular is going back since the beginning of agriculture, which was about 10,000 years ago, domestication of crops and livestock. This whole period has been one of relatively stable temperatures, and we're about to leave that comfortable range. So if nothing else, that's a real reason to pay close attention to what's going to happen there. Representative concentration pathways, you're familiar with these. We model different ones, but typically for our baseline scenario and what I'll present today, we're using one of the middle of the road ones, and in this case, 7.0, the emissions pathway. So just to highlight very briefly some of the key findings, of course, climate change is going to affect production, but the impacts vary widely by crop and by region. At the global scale, for example, maize appears to be much more vulnerable than does wheat. That's partly the nature of the crop. It's partly where it's grown. Tropical regions are more vulnerable than temperate regions, and that also happens to coincide with poorer countries versus richer countries. Changes both in long-term trends of temperature and precipitation, but also in the frequency and severity of extreme events, which is what is shown on the right here for Southern Africa at different emissions levels, seeing low yield events for maize resulting from a combination of temperature and precipitation, which might occur once in 20 years today, could increase in frequency to once in 10 years or even once in 5 years under different scenarios over time. Nevertheless, at least through mid-century, so over the next 25 years, socioeconomic factors continue to be bigger drivers of change in production than our climate. But after mid-century, of course, things change because the climate signal gets a lot louder and the population and income drivers tend to start moderating on a wider basis. So now, with all that, well, not preamble, but setting up, just wanted to run through a few recent results from a paper we did last year in global food security, as well as from the book that I mentioned a little bit earlier. Firstly, on the future of food demand, and focusing on the world panel, left of these most three here, we compare the rate of population growth to the rate of growth in demand for different food commodities. At the bottom there in red, world population is projected to increase by about 20% between 2020 and 2050. Demand for staples like cereals, roots, and tubers is projected to increase by between 30 and 40%, and demand for higher value commodities, fruits, vegetables, animal source foods, oils, and sugars by 40 to 50%. So it really does depend on what kind of food. If you compare low middle income countries with high income countries, it also depends on where you are, how rich you are, things like that. Similar pattern in low and middle income countries, although in each case a bit faster. Whereas in high income countries, some things are already leveling off, starting to decline. Staple demand, for example, for roots and tubers, for cereals, either declining already or starting to decline in the next decade or so for high income countries in aggregate. Things like fruits and vegetables, animal source foods, growing but more slowly than in low and middle income countries. And then there's the one interesting exception, oils and sugars. The orange line there continues to increase, reflects changes in preferences, convenience, urbanization, level of processing, and at the same time raises concerns about overweight, obesity, non-communicable diseases, heart disease, and stuff like that. So those are the big patterns. We can zoom in and look at a per capita comparisons in terms of, these are with calories on the y-axis here. You don't see much change in the staples in cereals and roots and tubers at the bottom of this figure in most regions. There's an exception. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but in Eastern and Southern Africa, in West and Central Africa, you see that even staples are still increasing. They're starting from such a low income level that when they get more, they still spend some of that on wheat, on rice, on other staple crops. But across the board, bigger increases in animal products, fruits and vegetables, some of these higher value things across the board, oils and sugars as well. I'm going to move quickly just to give you a flavor here, but we'll have hopefully then time for questions at the end. Sources of growth, yield growth is important almost everywhere. It's actually lowest in Southeast and Eastern Asia because yields are already quite high there. But several exceptions. In Eastern Southern Africa, in West and Central Africa, area increase continues to be an important source of increased production. In those cases, because they start at very low yield levels, so even with increases in yields, with the increase in demand due to population growth and income growth, it requires more area coming into production in order to meet that demand. Latin America also has a lot of area coming into production. It's not because their yields aren't high, they're already as high as they are in high income countries, but they're just such a big producer. They have a lot of land. Of course, there's a risk of conflict with deforestation and ecosystem services and so forth, but nevertheless, the projection is that a continued expansion of area in Latin America and Caribbean.
Question.
On climate change impacts, this is work in progress, so the numbers are changing, but I just wanted to highlight on the left in the map, these are results from a crop model. This is from DSAT for rain-fed maize. And of course, yellow, orange, red indicates yield declines 20, 30, 40% in some cases. What's really important here and what I wanted to emphasize is this is a good scientific experiment. It looks at changing climate and holds everything else constant. So that's a valid question to ask. It's not the question that we really want to ask is what impact is climate along with other things going to have on yields in the future. And for that, we have to look at not just holding changing climate while holding changes in technology and markets constant. We have to allow technology and markets to change as well. Because we know farmers are not going to keep on planting the same crop on the same date, using the same practices as climate changes around them. They're already changing. Climate has been changing for decades, and farmers have been changing along with that. On the right, you see a pair of box and whisker plots for each region. If you look over on the far right, West and Central Africa, for example, the first one of these is the straight crop model results. And if we change climate in West and Central Africa, but continue producing maize exactly the way we do today, we can expect that maize yields are going to drop by about 14% on average across West and Central Africa. But when we bring in changes in technology and changes in markets, then there's all kinds of feedback mechanisms and interactions that take place. And in fact, we expect that rain-fed maize yields are going to grow by 18% between 2025 and 2050 in West and Central Africa.
So question,
yeah.
So when you say changes in technology, they would have kind of happened anyhow, and the climate change degrades the baseline, but the baseline is expected to move up. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. Without climate change, this 18% might have been 20, 25%, it might have been more. But yes, the technology change, it's a combination of things. It's a result of investment in crop breeding and market infrastructure. It's also just what we think of as autonomous adaptation. Farmers just doing something differently because they see climate changing around them. So they might be planting a little bit earlier or a little bit later, or they might be switching crops or doing things in their management practices that compensate for some of those effects of climate. And those are all things which are not, they're excluded in the map on the left, which is, you know, strictly changing temperature and precipitation. So I flag this just because it's often the map on the left that gets put into the news headlines, because it's very appealing. It shows precise locations. It shows red. It confirms what we expect about climate change, but it's incomplete. And it's much less interesting to look at the figure on the right. We're working on a way to map the thing on the right so that we can show that in a more appealing way. But anyway, so climate change. Yeah.
Well, there's another question about you had a question?
Oh, hi. Yes. So I had a question about modeling how the technology grows.
Mm-hmm.
How do you account for that? Especially when you talked about the wheat, which is the rain-fed wheat growth. I imagine if something's wheat rain-fed, it would depend more on the climate.
Mm-hmm. Well, so when we talk about technology there, we're talking broadly both about the management practices, you know, if they've got a given variety, if they choose to plant it at a different date, or if they apply more fertilizer or water or things like that. But it's also different varieties of wheat that are coming out of breeding programs, which may be heat tolerant or drought tolerant or pest resistant or things like that. So we don't model that technology change endogenously. That comes from consultations with experts who, from whom we try to get a sense of, given what's in the pipeline, you know, what are they expecting to see in terms of yield growth for particular crops in particular countries around the world. And so we put those into our reference case. We do have a price elasticity, a supplier response, which, you know, based on historical data says that if we saw prices of, in this case, rain-fed maize increase by, let's say, 10%, then we would expect a supplier response from farmers. We're not modeling the fact that they increase their fertilizer by so much, but we have this elasticity, which is intended to capture some endogenous response to the fact that prices are higher. And that captures changes in inputs, but it also influences a shift. They might choose to shift some land out of maize and into another crop, or vice versa, depending on how the two prices are changing over time. So there's an endogenous part there, but as far as things like R&D, we just have to. So far, we just take that based on some informed assumptions. We would love to model that endogenously, but we don't do that at the moment.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Let me skim through some results quickly now. So we can look at what, after accounting for these things, climate and technology and markets and changes in demand and so forth, we get these final projections of yields. In this case, I'm showing you the example of cereals. We do it for all the other crops as well. But to show that they are rising throughout the world from different levels at different rates. They're rising in most cases, they're rising more slowly because of climate change, but that's captured already in this. And in each of these next few figures, we have the low and middle income regions on the left, and then on the right, what's called CG6. That's just the shorthand for CGI, our six developing regions, compared to rest of the world. And rest of the world is mostly high income countries and a few others. But here, of course, yields higher in the rest of the world, lower in CG6 regions, but rising in both cases. Similarly, area in cereals increases in most regions, not all of them. And it increases a little bit faster than it would have without climate change, because there's that yield penalty due to climate, and therefore area expands a little bit more to compensate. Way over on the right, you can see that the rest of the world, it's already, well, it's projected to peak in terms of area in cereals by about the middle of this projection period and then start to decline. If we put the production and demand figures together, the demand is the sort of bluish line in each of these regions, and domestic production is in red. In most of the developing regions, the demand is higher than production and the gap is increasing. There's an exception in Latin America and the Caribbean, where it's about balanced today, but their production is going to grow faster than demand. And similarly, in the rest of the world, the high-income countries in general, production is higher than total demand. And that is reflected next in net trade, again, focusing just on the cereals example. So negative numbers here mean a country is a net, or a region is a net importer of cereals, and a positive number means they're a net exporter. And the overall pattern here is almost all of the low and middle income regions, they're net importers of cereals already, and they're going to become larger net importers of cereals in the future. The exception is Latin America, which is their exports are projected to grow. And of course, on the far right, the US, Russia, Ukraine, a lot of these traditional Australia, Europe, big producers already, big exporters, and will continue and in fact increase their net exports of cereals. That's true for a lot of commodities. There are a few cases, fruits and vegetables, where some of the low and middle income countries are net exporters to Europe, to North America. But by and large, the balance is that those regions are going to be importing more food in the future. Okay, it's not the end of the story. We can do something about it. I'm not going to go in detail into policies and investments, but just to say we can model. We do model things like, what if we increased agricultural R&D investments? What if we increased investment in improving soil and water management, or infrastructure to give farmers better access to markets, both for inputs and for the outputs that they're selling? Or a package that brings those different things together. Those trace through to affect all the things that we've been looking at, but I'm just going to pick one example here, one metric, which is the population at risk of hunger, and trace through how climate and investment affect these results. So focusing on the left here, these are the world figures, the tallest bars. The blue bar is the number of people at risk of hunger in 2010. So that's just sort of a starting reference point. Over 800 million people around the world, and this is consistent with FAO statistics, who report this number every year. The next bar, the yellow gold one, shows a hypothetical world in 2050 without climate change. If the other things we've talked about are changing, technology and markets and so forth, we would expect that, or our projections are that the number of people at risk of hunger would fall by about half, to about 400 million. So a lot of improvements there. The third bar, the gray one, brings in the climate impact, and that sets us back. It brings about 100 million people back into hunger who would not have been hungry in the absence of climate change. But the fourth and the final one, and the whiskers here are showing different climate and socioeconomic assumptions, different scenarios there. The fourth bar here, the orange one, is if we put in a comprehensive package of investments in R&D, in soil and water management, in market infrastructure, and so forth, we can bring those hunger numbers back down, even below what they would have been in the absence of climate change. But of course, all of these investments come at a price, and that's one of the choices that policymakers are facing, that we are trying to inform when they confront those decisions. And you can see the regional patterns there as well. This, and again, I won't go into this for reasons of time, but just to show different investment strategies, they affect different indicators. This is a subset. We look at other indicators as well, but depending on what you invest, where you invest it, you might get better impacts on income or on hunger or on resource use. But there's a trade-off, because different ones accomplish different things. If you look at the bottom row, the comprehensive investment scenario, you can get wins all across the board, but it comes at a higher price tag. So everything has a trade-off. That's the kind of information that we try and present to decision makers. Sometimes they're national governments, sometimes they're UN agencies, sometimes they're donor agencies like Gates Foundation or USAID until earlier this year. But the ones who are making investments across regions, across different parts of the portfolio, and wondering, what do we get if we do it here versus there? So to sum up, demand is projected to increase, different rates in different areas for different commodities. Production will keep pace. This is contrary to what Malthus projected several hundred years ago. But that growth is slowed by climate change. And that means it's more costly to achieve. A couple examples, it means it comes at a higher price, and that imposes risks to food security. It comes at the expense of more area expansion, more land and water brought into production. So that has impacts on ecosystem services. Again, the impacts vary a lot by crop, by location. One overall pattern is that tropical countries, low and middle income countries, are more vulnerable, and therefore, as part of the consequence, they'll become more dependent on food imports. And finally, really critical to be aware of links, trade-offs, synergies, and to model this stuff from an integrated perspective. And I'm sure that's something which you all know better than I do, but just reinforcing that message. We're still working on areas we'd like to improve. We'd like to do better on land use change and water. We want to do more on climate variability and extreme events, not just the long-term trends. We're working on that with MIT already, but we'd love to do more. We model different nutritional outcomes, but there's lots we'd like to do better. We want to do a better job of capturing distributional impacts, differences by income classes, by urban versus rural, potentially by gender, things like that, which we don't capture in our current modeling framework. And then at the bottom, some sort of technical and process related things. We want to make our results more accessible, more quickly accessible. We'd love to be able to do a lot of this stuff in real time, so that if we're sitting with a decision maker and they say, well, what if such and such, we can actually say, well, here's the difference that would make. Right now, it takes us time to turn all the cranks, and so we can't do it as quickly as we'd like. And we've got other ideas, bringing in AI to help speed up or inform different parts of the process, improve spatial resolution, look farther out into the future than 2050. Lastly, this is one of several modeling systems we have in our unit. This one is the global long-term perspective. We have colleagues that work at the national level, go much more in-depth, economy-wide, different policy options and so forth. That's the RIAPA framework. We have our affectionately named Spatial Production Allocation Model, or SPAM, which puts together national statistics and remote sensing data to come up with consistent pixel-level maps of where crops are produced and so forth that are inputs into our analysis. And finally, it's really critical to see these analyses as part of a process of discussion and dialogue. Needs to be iterative, needs to hear what stakeholders are concerned about, what decision makers are looking for, and eventually feed into a decision-making process. Lots of information available in publications. One to highlight at the bottom here, coming out early next year, we will have our new Global Outlook report, which will have updated projections on all of these indicators and more. So there will be more information available soon. And with that, thanks very much for your interest, and happy to hear any questions you might have.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Nibon, you have a question?
Oh, sorry. I meant to give the applause.
Well, cool.
Raise my hand.
No, it's fantastic.
Thanks for the talk.
Thank you. Jendra, you have a question?
Yes, I have a short question. First of all, yeah, very, very insightful information is. Thank you for presentation. I have a short question that are we also considering the economic incentives farmers getting to, like, are they that catalyze the more sustainable production in the future, and like the impact of the if they are not getting the right economic incentive?
Yeah. So two-part answer. One is that we get some feedback incentives from price signals at the moment already, because we have this elasticity relationship. It varies by commodity, it varies by location, that just says if the price of wheat is changing in this way and the price of potatoes is changing in that way, that there is an impact on farmers' choices there. But I think what you're asking is, do we capture things like specific policy incentives to improve, say, more sustainable practices or things like that? They're not in our reference scenario. We could develop a specific policy scenario that says, well, what would that look like? And how might so we can explore that through a special scenario that we would develop, and then compare that to our reference scenario to see how much difference that would make. We did
Thank
some
you.
work about a decade ago that looked at a variety of different practices, including levels of nitrogen application, or frequency of tillage, whether it's conventional plowing or no-till or reduced tillage, some things like that. And so we have some results. That was, I think, 2014, 2015. There was a book that came out on those specific scenarios. And so we have done that in the past, but what that would require is a specific policy alternative scenario, like we've done for different investment levels. It's something that we could explore. It's not in our standard reference scenario.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Actually, I have a question that was very much related to this thing, because it's tricky to. I'm thinking all the developing world countries. In a lot of ways, if the economies are functioning perfectly, it's obvious. Well, if you apply the latest technology, your yields are going to go up. You'll be able to sell to international markets and so on. The barriers to that and kind of how you can get over them, because I'm curious about how do you model that? How do you model the profit that the regions get, governments, banks would get from doing these practices to incentivize them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, really, really important question. And again, I can see at least a couple parts to that. One is the barriers that farmers in these countries already face, and part of that is the cost of getting inputs to those countries, whether it's energy, whether it's fertilizer, whether it's new crop varieties. There are longer lags getting them to those places. There are higher costs even once you land it at the port. The domestic infrastructure is such there's a higher cost of getting it in country to where farmers are actually using it. In addition to the basic infrastructure costs, there may also be other institutional costs. You might have to pay to move between districts. There might be official and unofficial kind of costs that are higher in countries like that. We do have a measure of that. It's not a precise measure, and we really do need to update it. But we have a measure of how those kinds of costs differ in different countries, which can be then a barrier both to getting inputs into the country as well as getting outputs out. The other part of your question, I think, though, in terms of modeling, what we can model are, I didn't show you all the indicators, but that's the type of thing that we can model. We can show how production will change. We can show how demand or availability of calories and other nutrients will change in a country under different scenarios. We can show how prices will change, what that means for the number of people who are able to afford enough food to not be classified as at risk of hunger. But we can't necessarily measure measure the types of things that the Minister of Agriculture really wants to know that would convince him or her that they should be doing X rather than Y. We don't know all of their own incentives. What we can show them are these kinds of things that say, here are things which seem like they're definite improvements. We can also put it against the fact that, well, this is going to cost more area, or you're going to have to get the water from somewhere, and that means an argument with the Ministry of something else. We can kind of flag those sorts of trade-offs or potential challenges, but we don't have a metric that says in the end, this is going to increase whatever your barometer is by, so many percent and know what that impact is going to be. That's the real dilemma. And if you remember back to the slide where I showed IFPRI's sort of 3 strategic legs, one was that situation outlook kind of work, one was finding solutions, and the third one was the governance one, working with partners to actually see how can we, maneuver this into something that really then gains traction in a particular political context. And that's the part that in our group we don't do as nearly as well as we would like to, and I'm not quite sure how. It'd be a great thing to explore. But we have colleagues who then can take these sorts of results and say, look, how can we work these into our conversation to be influential?
Got it. Yeah, and Ravi, you had a question?
Yeah, great talk, by the way. Thanks so much. I had a question going back to the slide on the combined impacts on hunger. And so by, just eyeballing what I saw on the slide there, there's about 100 million people in the balance between, with climate change,
Right.
impacts on hunger worldwide, and the effect of mitigations, which would reduce that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a huge number, of course. But oddly enough, I mean, maybe you could give me some intuition around this. Given, as a percentage, given the huge drop that's happening anyway, that we expect by 2050 to have the number of people in hunger, that's a 50% drop, right? Oddly enough, if I think of it in those terms, it feels like, oh, it's not that bad. I was expecting it to be catastrophic. Now, of course, 100 million people hungry is catastrophic.
Yeah.
But is there a way to, first of all, give the intuition behind this? And secondly, is there a different presentation that can highlight this? Because as presented, this seems like, okay, given the size of those error bars and given the relative changes in those numbers, it doesn't seem catastrophic.
Yeah.
So those are my 2 questions.
Yeah. No. And good questions. It is sometimes surprising to people because we expect it to be different. So some caveats on those numbers. First of all, as I mentioned, these are looking out to 2050. So the next couple of decades, sure, we're feeling climate impacts already, and they'll get worse, and they'll continue to get worse before they get better. But they will get more worse, pardon my language, after 2050 because the climate signal gets even stronger. And we expect, and on the other side of the coin, it's just that the economic drivers are so powerful at present. You have parts of the world with big population growth starting from low income levels where even modest increases in income generate big changes in demand. Whereas other parts of the world, in North America and Europe, in many parts of Asia, an increase in income, it's just not going to change food demand at all. People have as much as they want, and it's not going to, those economic drivers aren't going to be big determinants. But that will shift. So after this projection period, if we look farther out into the future, and I said our model only goes to 2050 at present, but we'd like to extend that. But we would expect the relative impacts of climate to get larger and of these socioeconomic drivers to get smaller. Having said that, it is still true that to 2050, the impacts on that hunger metric are less from climate than they are from the socioeconomic. But another caveat here is we are looking at the changes in the kind of trend levels of temperature and precipitation by 2050. We're not capturing all of the extreme events and the droughts. And for most people, that's where they first experience climate change.
Right.
The fact that it might be a 1/10 of a degree warmer in a few years than it was, nobody feels that. What they feel is a hurricane or a drought, and things that then push towards migration and other things, which obviously have been big stresses for many countries in recent years. So these numbers don't capture that extreme events side of the picture, and that's the side that we really would like to be able to say more about in the future. But yeah, you caught a really important aspect of this story here.
Cool. And then
If I
last
may,
question.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Anybody have a question?
Oh, yes. Actually, relating to Ravi's question, the error bars there that you had, um, is the are the outputs of the model, are those the outputs of the IFRI model?
They're the results of the IFPRI model, bringing in the results from climate models from other sources.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these error bars that you had, are the models stochastic or are they deterministic?
They're deterministic. So they're not. I mean, it's not a confidence interval, but yes, it shows the range over the different scenarios that we have run with the, in this case specifically, the different RCP, the emissions scenarios and the different socioeconomic scenarios. So we use those just to indicate that although we have a deterministic result from the particular scenario we ran, it's not the only possible one. But
so okay. So did you so did you run this deterministic model on a distribution of possible scenarios, and that's how you got the outputs?
We have run it on, in general, when we update to the new assessment report, the new results from CMIP and so forth, then we run the whole mix of RCPs and SSP combinations, even though technically some of them shouldn't be run together because, an RCP 8.5, they'll tell you it's not consistent with SSP 1. We run them all just so we have them all in the library. But typically, we don't use that full thing to generate a distribution. I see my colleague Tim coming in who can answer that question more specifically. So Tim Sulzer leads the actual impact modeling team. So Tim, maybe you can shed light on that. And we're probably close to time here, but
yeah.
Thanks, Pete.
Yeah, I'll be brief. It is so. Yes, and this is part of our challenge of actually communicating all of this very large pile of results and trying to communicate it. They're technically not error bars or a confidence interval. They are just showing the range of the different combinations, and so we're not pulling from a distribution. We're pulling from the different combinations of RCPs and SSPs, and GCMs for that matter, the global circulation models. So so every combination is a deterministic outcome, and then if you go across the range of outputs from those things is what's represented by those whiskers. It's unsatisfying for the higher level statistician and econometricians out there, but it's a much more, there are very few ways to actually communicate this effectively. But anyway, so that's the basic story.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. I think Ravi has a comment.
Yeah. So the drop in hunger is because of the modest changes in income in the LIC market make huge changes in hunger drops that outweighs the impact of CC over the next 25 years. But after 25 years, CC will dominate. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know when exactly the change will occur, but it will over time. The climate gets progressively bigger, and especially in those countries that are sensitive to food insecurity and even small changes in income. Ironically, I didn't show this, but in almost every case, the net impacts on climate change are worse in these low and middle income regions. Not only are they better or less bad in the rest of the world, in some cases they're countries which tend to be temperate countries, but in fact, in some cases, there are actual benefits from climate change in the higher income countries.
So then, one last question. So you have a lot of excellent tools that you guys have developed. What portions of them are available for the public to use?
For the public, they're not publicly accessible yet. We would like to do that. We at the moment we share them with collaborators that we work with. The full documentation is available. It has all the equations in it, but we don't actually share the code at the moment. We would like. Yeah,
we're a commercial entity, so I'm not sure if we were to run something like this, is that possible, or is it like nonprofit only, or how does that work?
We could talk about it. Okay, yeah, we'd be happy to talk about it. Yeah.
All right, yeah, sounds great. It's good to know. So I think we're a little bit past time, and thank you very much for your time and the valuable insights.
Oh, last question, Keith. So sure. although we can't access the models, is there like an archive paper or something that we can access where the data sets came in from and the
Yeah,
equations for the models?
I mean, the latest documentation is from last year. I think we're going to update that again pretty soon. That's publicly available. There's lots of papers. We have some data that are available on Dataverse. I think both the results as well as some of our input files. Tim, you can be more specific on that. But yeah, if you, I mean, my email was on the last slide there. And Greg, I guess do you post the slides or a PDF
slides
version of
and a summary. If you send me any links that you think should be included in the summary, for like the archival,
Yeah.
please send them.
No, please feel free to follow up, because there are lots of pieces that we can share on request, but there's a limited amount of stuff that's just actually available online. And I see my colleagues have put some links in already. So.
Excellent.
Thank you. Yeah, that looks wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, well, excellent. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thanks
and
for the talk.
keep in touch if you have questions.